Welcome to the debut of Impact Portsmouth, presented by Wild Adventurous Life.
Hello, beautiful people. Hello. How you doing? All right, so thank you so much to these guys for inviting me. I think it's amazing what they're doing. So just a quick round of applause for Jen and Amy. And then also a little bit of love for Kathleen and for Sandy for sharing their stories. Pretty cool. So as Jen was telling you, yeah, I'm a kid from Lawrence, Mass. It's about 30 miles north of Boston, by the Merrimack River. And so my story kind of begins May 1981. And I'm 12 years old, and my mother had gone out the night in question, and my sister and I thought we were so cool because I was 12, she was 13, about to turn 14, and we didn't think we needed a babysitter anymore. But what we didn't realize is that Mrs. Turgeon downstairs was actually keeping an eye on us, but we still thought we were pretty cool. And so the way it worked, if you were ever a teenager, you know how it is. Your parents go out, and you're supposed to be in bed by a certain time, but you never go to bed when you're supposed to. So we would always like hide behind the curtains, and then if we saw my mother's car pull up outside, we would like book it to bed, you know. And my mother was no dummy, you know. She would always come upstairs, and I'd be in bed like pretending I was asleep. And she'd lean in, and as she was, you know, nuzzling my neck, she'd say, "I know you're awake, you little shit." And my mother was the love of my life. She still is the love of my life. She is what I call my true north. My mother had a gravitational pull that you could not resist. She was 33 years old the night that she went out to go bowling. She was a wicked good bowler, too. Both her and my dad, who's actually my stepdad, but I consider him my dad, they were in the same bowling league. But at this time, they were separated. My parents had been separated like 18,000 times, but this one seemed pretty serious. We knew he was already dating a woman named Elaine. And my mother was still madly in love with him, but it didn't seem like it was going to work out. We hadn't seen my father in a couple of months. It had been a while. So my mother went out. My sister and I stayed up. We went to bed. Next morning, we woke up, and I could hear somebody like in the kitchen. My bedroom, we lived in a double-decker, and my bedroom was on the other side of kind of like this partition wall. But I could hear somebody on the other side, and so I said, all right, I got up, and I found my sister, still in her pajamas, standing in the doorway of my mother's bedroom and just looking. And so I went in there, and I stood there, and I looked, and my mother's bed was empty. And this is weird, because it's like 7:30 in the morning. My mother is not a morning person at all. In fact, it was our job to make sure she got her ass out of bed, coffee in her hand, Marlboro Red, you know, before she got to work. And so it was really weird that her bed was empty. It hadn't been slept in. We looked around. There was no note. There was no half-empty coffee cup. There was no Marlboro in the ashtray. We looked outside. Her car wasn't there. And my mother was an insurance underwriter at McCarthy Insurance in Lawrence, and we thought, oh, maybe she just had an early client, forgot to tell us, whatever. And so my sister said, go get ready for school. I'm going to stay home, which I didn't think was fair, but I liked school, and I had a crush on Stevie Bryan, so I was like, okay, I'm going to go. And so I went to school, and my sister stayed home, and the whole time I was at school, I just kept looking at the clock thinking, oh, I can't wait till I go home and I can see my mother, like when she gets home from work. And when I got home from school at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my sister was being wicked weird. And she was on the phone, but she would like, back then, remember phones had cords, right? So we had like this Mickey Mouse phone, and it would sit in this little cubby, and she had the fucking curly-Q cord stretched so far around the corner that it was like straight. And she wouldn't, like every time I came in the room, she'd be like, get out of here. So I didn't know what was going on. I just kept saying, did you hear from Ma? You talk to Ma? And she says, no. So my dad was a Wonder Bread guy. So we always had like Twinkies and stuff in the house. So she's like, get some Twinkies, go watch TV. So I went around the corner, I got my snacks, I'm on the couch watching Tom and Jerry and loving life. But knowing something, I'm like, something's not right. Why is my sister acting this? I mean, she was always a jerk to me, but, that's how it is with siblings that are a year and a half apart. So I'm watching TV and I hear a car door slam outside and I look out the window and I see my father getting out of Ronnie Bonanno's car. And Ronnie Bonanno was like, we called him Uncle Ronnie, he wasn't really our uncle. And I was like, why is Ronnie dropping Dad off at the house? My first thought, and then my second thought was, I was just so psyched to see him. My mother was the love of my life. My father, I worshiped the ground he walked on. I was in equal amounts fear and awe of him. My father never hit us, but he poked us a lot. Don't do it again. He would slam my sister up against the wall. Because my sister, I learned how to keep my mouth shut. My sister would just say whatever came to her mind, which means she was the one that bore the brunt of the suffering. But anyways, I see him and I'm just psyched. And so I turn around, my sister hangs up the phone and I say, it's Dad. And I take off down the stairs, and as I go, I hear her say, what the hell is he doing here? Because all she knows is that when he's around, she is going to suffer. So I run downstairs, and I look at him. My dad is my stepdad, but he's Italian and Portuguese. So even by May, he's got a pretty good tan going on, right? He's a really good-looking guy. And so we come onto the porch. I see him, and just as that happens, Sue Turgeon, who's my sister's best friend, who lives downstairs, she opens up her door. And my father says, go back inside. And Sue knows better than to mess with him, so she shuts the door, and I look up at him, and I'm like, hi, Dad. And he doesn't smile back at me. And he says, come on, kid, let's go upstairs. We go upstairs, he says, sit down. So we both sat on the couch, my sister and I, and he sits down on the coffee table in front of us. And he won't look at us, and he just puts his hands on his knees, and he's just looking down. And then he looks up at us, and he says, all right, look, I'm just going to tell you, your mother is dead. My sister freaks out, she takes off, and I say, Dad, what happened to Ma? And he says, you don't want to know, kid. You don't want to know. And my sister starts freaking out. Now, my father loved toughness. That's one of the things he loved about me. I was a girl, but I looked like a boy. I acted like a boy, and so I didn't cry. He didn't hug my sister. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer any condolence. He wasn't touching me. Nobody was hugging anybody, so I just thought, oh, I'm not supposed to cry. So I just stuffed it all down. My sister's freaking out. She's doing enough crying for the both of us. And she starts screaming, what happened? What did you do? What happened? And he says, I don't know all the details yet, but it's already in the paper. It's going to be a pretty big deal. And he gets up and he walks into the kitchen. Now, my sister knows that the Tribune comes at around this time, the Lawrence Eagle Tribune. So she hauls ass downstairs and she grabs the paper. And just as she's grabbed the paper, a friend of my mother's comes to the house. Because unbeknownst to me, and I wouldn't know this for 27 years, because nobody in my family ever talked about it, my sister had been calling people all day long looking for my mother. So she showed up, and my sister, I can hear her screaming down on the porch, he says she's dead, he says she's dead, he says it's in the paper. So Dot, my mother's friend, sends my sister into Sue's house, and she comes upstairs with the paper, and she slaps it down on the table, sees me, and she takes off into the kitchen to have it out with my father. So they're doing their whole thing. My sister's downstairs, and I'm sitting there by myself. I'm 12 years old. My mother is dead. And I imagine I'm in some sort of shock. But I also hear in my head, it's in the paper. And so I'm fucking terrified to look. But I've always been a curious kid. My mantra when I was a kid was, why ma, why ma, why ma, why ma, right? So I pick up the paper. It's folded in half. And I'm like, okay, I've got to somehow find the courage to look at this thing. And so I just kind of took it in sections. I would flip it one way and look real quick, see nothing. So this is it. This is the paper that I see. And at the bottom, on the front page of the Lawrence Eagle Tribune, it says, "Woman's body found." Methuen. The partially clad body of an unidentified woman was found this morning at 11:45 a.m. by cemetery workers on Nevins Road. According to Police Chief Francis Morse, the woman's body, with the head mutilated, was found near the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, Hillside Acres Cemetery. Morse, who called a medical examiner to the scene, said police were unable to identify the woman. Methuen detectives and state police are investigating. And so when I read this, I think, they're talking about my mom. And I'm a smart enough kid to know that partially clad means that she didn't have some of her clothing on. I would later learn that she was found half naked from the waist down. Head mutilated. She couldn't be identified because she had been beaten and kicked to death. Her face was so unidentifiable they didn't know who she was. And she had been left there to die on the side of the road. I found out later that she actually died from all of the injuries. Her death certificate says multiple blunt injuries to the head and the neck. But I've talked to all the detectives on the case. I've talked to a bunch of different people, and they all said, your mother ended up choking to death on her own blood. Nobody in my family ever talked about it. It was on the newspapers, it was on the TV, it was on the radio. Anytime it came on, it would get shut off. My dad comes back into the room. I set the paper down. He doesn't know I've seen it. And he says to me, come on, kid, pack a bag. We got to go. I said, where are we going? Because I'm just thinking, well, now he's going to move back to the apartment. He's going to live with us. We're just going to be a family again. He said, we're going to your Uncle John and Auntie Connie's house. Now, my mother had been adopted when she was a baby, but this was considered her brother. And we got up. I didn't have a backpack. We were kind of poor. So I grabbed a plastic bag from Market Basket. It was Demoulas back then. And I just threw my pajamas and a toothbrush and maybe some undies or whatever in there. And we just kept crying. My sister kept crying, saying, we just want to stay here with you. We just want to stay here with you. And he said, we got to go. I never slept at that house again. And so what happened was it was a series of losses. You know, so I lost my mom, I lost my dad, I lost my home, I lost everything, and I ended up going to live with an aunt and uncle who I barely knew. So I basically moved in with some strangers. Okay? And there's so many details to this, but we don't have the time, so I'm just going to keep fast forwarding. And so I basically live with them from the time that I'm 12 until the time that I'm 17. And so I'm suffering that whole time, you know. I started drinking. I remember the first time I got high, Jimmy Carrillo, down at the Stadium Projects, 12 years old. The first time I got drunk was on Mad Dog. Do you guys remember that stuff? Oh my God. It was terrible. It was terrible. I couldn't walk the next day. Literally could not walk. I had to crawl everywhere around my stepsister's house. And so I started doing all those things at a very young age, right? I actually smoked my first cigarette when I was 8, and we got caught. It was the only time my mother ever hit me. She smacked me right in the mouth because I was being fret. I deserved it, though. It was like she came from Miami and went all the way up to New Hampshire. But I deserved it. Anyway, so I started doing a lot of things because I was suffering, because nobody was talking about it. I had no tools. I didn't know how to work through the pain that I was experiencing. And so I started to look for things outside of myself. Oh, I'll drink. I'll have some fun. And then boys, right? I lost my virginity way too young, way younger than I had any business losing it. Books saved me. Books and writing, journaling, totally saved me. So I spent some time doing that too. Okay, so now I'm living with my aunt and uncle. I get myself somehow miraculously into BU, into Boston University. And what nobody knows is that I've cultivated this plan, okay? They caught the guy that killed my mother. In fact, they caught him the very next day. He was a prominent local businessman. His name was Paul Carvo. And he was sent to prison. And then he got out for a little while because his family had a lot of money. He got out and he was kind of walking around the streets for a little while. And then his trial came in 1982 and he was convicted, life in prison. So he was in prison. I'm at BU. I'm 17, my freshman year. I'm about to turn 18. And I say, I know how I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to ask him why. I said, I'm going to get in my car after finals and I'm going to go to the Norfolk State Prison and I'm going to sit down. Now, would they have ever let me in to talk to the guy? I don't know, but this was my plan. I'm going to go talk to him and I'm going to sit down with him, and as soon as I know why, then I'll be okay. I'll have the answers. My suffering will stop. So it's December 1986. It's like probably around December 15th, 16th, 17th. And, I'm getting ready to go home for Christmas break. I have one more final to take. And I was too poor. I didn't have a phone in my room, so I would be down in the lobby, like in my pajamas, like shoving quarters into the phone to call back home. So I'm calling my boyfriend, Buddy. And I get on the phone with Buddy, to say, hey, I'm coming home in a couple of days or whatever. But Buddy is acting weird. And I'm like, his real name is Francis. So I'm like, Francis, what's going on? He says, Paul Corriveau is dead. And I just lose my mind right there in the lobby. I said, what do you fucking mean Paul Corriveau is dead? He said he hung himself 3 days ago. I slam down the phone and I call my sister, and before she can even answer, hello, I'm like, and when were you going to tell me? And she said, Kay, you were doing finals, like you were doing good. We didn't want to upset you. And nobody knew, because nobody in my family talked about anything. So I just ran upstairs into my room. Of course, I fell on the stairs, cut my shin, blood everywhere. It's a holy mess. And I throw myself on the bed and I cry and cry and cry. Because now I'm screwed. There's my plan to get peace. I go home, Christmas break. It's a few days later. I walk into my stepfather's house, because that's the routine. Right? We would go there on Christmas Eve. And they were all, Italian. I'm like an Irish Catholic kid, from Lawrence. So they're all, my step-family, they're all Italian and Portuguese. They're all around the table with the Crown Royal and the marinara sauce and the octopus and like all this stuff. And my Uncle Manny, all right? Now, my Uncle Manny is the kind of guy, he got a tattoo of an eyeball on his shoulder when he was in his 40s. And I said, Uncle Manny, what's with the tattoo? He goes, that's because when the bastards try to stab me in the back, I see them coming, kid. So my Uncle Manny is like a toast. And so everybody gets quiet around the table. Now, they can't see me. I'm standing in the doorway. They can't see me. And he says, a toast. May that cocksucker rot in hell. And everybody cheers. And I'm standing in the doorway, and I realize in that moment, that's not how I feel. Because in this moment, I remember, he has little kids, Paul Corriveau. He's somebody's kid. He's somebody's father. He's somebody's husband. And there's a crack that happens. You know how Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack in everything, and it's how the light gets in? So in that moment, I stopped seeing this guy who brutally beat my mother to death as a fucking monster and an animal, and I actually started to see him as a human. And so there's this little window where the suffering kind of stops for a second, because now I'm feeling for somebody else. And that taught me something. And I also realized that I didn't know how to talk to my family about these things that I was feeling, so I didn't. And I just did some more stuffing, and I just kind of kept it all to myself, and I journaled and stuff like that. So fast forward, I graduate from BU, I end up moving to California. And I'm still looking for answers. I'm still trying to find a way to get out of my own way, but I don't have any tools. You grow up in Lawrence, it's like somebody hurt you, it's like an eye for an eye. You do something, there was no forgiveness happening in my world. And so the one thing I always had, I never had money, but I would always have books somehow. My mother got me a library card when I was a kid. So when I moved to LA and I didn't know anybody, the way that I would find pieces, I would go into the bookstore. And back then, I was really into bodybuilding. And so I was really into lifting weights. So I was in the health, in the section where all the things were. And while I'm in that section, I hear a voice in my head literally say, you should go over to the self-help section, because you could use some help. And I was like, okay. And so I just start walking over there, and I get in there, and I'm just standing there and looking around, and literally, I shit you not, this is what happens. This book, now there's nobody else in the aisle with me. There's no reason why it should happen, but this book goes like this, and literally falls at my feet. And I look down, and I'm like, who's this broad? I'm like, well, she looks kind of nice. She's got a nice smile. And it's Marianne Williamson, A Return to Love, Reflections on the Principles of A Course in Miracles. And I sit down and I start to read this book right in the store. And this was before, like, Borders would put chairs everywhere. So I'm just sitting on the floor like a poor kid, like usual, like a little weirdo. And I start reading this book. And the things she says in this book both equally inspire me and completely piss me off. Because she's talking in a way that nobody has ever talked before. She's talking about concepts of forgiveness and stuff that nobody has ever said to me before. And I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Okay? So like 2 years goes by, this becomes huge. She's on Oprah, it becomes a huge bestseller. You have all in some way heard the quote, our deepest fear is not that we are, our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure, all these things. So it's been attributed to Nelson Mandela, no. Coach Carter in the movie, no. It's Marianne's quote. So anyways, I start reading this book, and I also pick up the other book that she's always referencing, which is called A Course in Miracles. And it's like a 1,200-page book, and it's called spiritual psychotherapy. And what it promises you is the peace of God through forgiveness. Now, don't get weird about the word God. I always say, like, part of my mission is to make the word God cool again. Because God, when I think of God, it's not like some white dude in the sky who's like rationing out punishment. To me, the word God simply means love. Like, that's it. So, I get this book, I start doing this stuff. Marianne blows up, her career is huge. She's lecturing in LA, but I have no car. I have no way to get down there to see her. But finally, at some point, I get a car, and I start going to her lectures. And then one day, she's doing this workshop on relationships. And I am dating, at this point, a guy named Brenton, who's a magician. Brenton, okay, and so I'm like, all right, he's making me nuts. I'm going to go to this workshop. I'm going to ask a question about relationships. And so I get in line, and there's a mic, and you're going to stand there. And when I get to the microphone, it is literally like something else takes over my body, and I hear myself say, I kind of don't get this whole forgiveness thing. And she's like, darling, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean about that? And I'm like, yeah. So what happened is my mother started coming to me in dreams. And one of the dreams she said to me was, she said, I've forgiven him. Now it's your turn. But I didn't know how. I asked Marianne the question. She brought me up on stage. And she hugs me close. And she whispers in my ear, let me just be your mother for a moment. And I just start to sob. And now the whole Agape church is like crying because we're doing this whole work in front of the whole room. And she says, who else in this room has another issue like this around murder? And like 7 people came forward. And it blew my mind. So we ended up having this whole huge thing. And it was amazing. And people came up to me afterwards and they're like, I've been watching Marianne for years. I've never seen anything like that. Who are you? And I'm just like, I'm just a kid from Boston. Like, I don't know. And eventually, some of Marianne's people said she wants to talk to you. And they pulled me aside. And she said, who are you? And I'm like, I'm Karen. She's like, what do you do? And I'm like, well, I want to be a writer, but I'm a waitress, She's like, we need to stay in touch. I was like, okay. I was so excited because this was like meeting your hero. Like, she was my hero at this point. And so, long story short, we end up developing a relationship. I end up going to live with her and work with her, and she becomes my spiritual mom and mentor to this day. She still is. Some of you might have come to my event. I had her in Concord in February of last year, and she came and spoke for all of us. So it was like 700 people. It was amazing. But it was through living with Marianne and working with Marianne that I was able to start to gather some tools in my toolbox. and I was able to start to free myself. Because what happens is what people don't get, okay? So I had to work on forgiving my mother's killer. Most people, it's like, they never put the toilet seat up, right? We all have our stuff, but we will obsess over the littlest things. So here in the room, raise your hand. I don't care at what magnitude it is, small, big, whatever. Who here has some forgiveness work to do? Who here has a person, it might be yourself or somebody that you're not forgiving? Yeah, right? None of us are alone. And so I started doing this work, and one of the things that Marianne said to me one day, she turned to me and she said, "You've got some choices to make." And I was like, I don't know what you mean. Because at that point, I had become a professional victim. I had learned at a very young age that I could pull out that dead mother card anytime, and I could get away with all kinds of shit. Oh, not turning your homework? Oh, my mother just died. And who isn't going to feel bad? I could get away with pretty much anything. And so I learned how to use that as part of my identification. So I started moving through the world leading with my wound. Now imagine now as adults if I came up to you and the first thing I said to you was, when I was 12, my mother was murdered, and then I was totally inappropriately touched, and I was raped, and then I had like 3 miscarriages, and I blah, blah, blah. You'd be like, what the fuck? Who wants to be friends with that girl? But so many of us, that's what we do. We lead with our wounds because we don't have the tools to figure out how to navigate life, man. Just the stuff that happens to all of us. I mean, there's 3 of us up here telling stories, but every single person in this room I know has a story, and I could sit down with you and you could tell me. And the beautiful thing about storytelling is you cannot hear somebody's story without eventually falling in love with them and being able to understand them. And so part of my work was starting to get to know Paul Carabo. So I did a lot of research on his family because A, I'm writing a memoir, I'm writing a book, but B, I wanted to understand what could make a person do such a thing. And I could share a lot with you, but I don't have the time, but read the book when it comes out and you'll learn all about it. But it's what really helped me to start to forgive him. But Marianne said to me, you have some choices to make. She said, you can keep letting what happened to you define you and how you move through the world, or you can choose something else. In A Course in Miracles, there's a beautiful line that says, my brother, you can choose again. I can choose peace instead of this. And what I started to learn, what A Course in Miracles is spiritual psychotherapy. And what I started to learn is if I could change my mind, I could change my world. I could either live from my circumstances or I could start to live from my choices. And so what I started to choose was love over fear. And you've heard this all the time. Yoga teachers love to throw that around, but they don't even know really what they're talking about when they say that because they just say shit. Don't drink the Kool-Aid, okay? Ask them, what do you mean by that? So when we talk about choosing love over fear, what we really mean is choosing divine love, the kind of love that includes everybody. What a lot of us have is what we call special relationships or selective love, or what I call sometimes selective compassion. And so we only extend it to the people we like or the people we love or the people who are easy. But the truth is that we are all one. Yoga teaches us this. That's what yoga means. It means union. It's non-duality, not two, meaning there's only one of us. And so anything that I put out to you, I'm actually doing it to myself. And the thing about not forgiving is, it's so interesting. It's like, we feel really righteous. Well, they did this thing to me. I deserve to be angry. And I'm like, yeah, but you basically are putting this person in your own little personal grievance jail. It's like you created your own little personal prison and then you threw that person in there. And the funny thing about prisons, though, is that when you put people in prison, does everybody just get to go home at the end of the day? Who also has to be in the prison? The gods. So anytime you put somebody in your little personal prison, who's in there with them standing guard? When you practice forgiveness, and I'm not going to go into it because we don't have the time, but when you practice it on that level, there's nothing you can't forgive. And being alive today is like being in the fucking forgiveness Olympics. Okay? So for me, it's like the worst things that could happen to me have already happened. So I'm always just like, bring it. There's really not much you can do at this point that I can't somehow be like, I may not want to hang out with you or have lunch with you, but I can forgive you. And when you can move through the world with that kind of ability to really see people, to really see who they are, to understand their stories, to know that their behaviors, like as we say in A Course in Miracles, it's either a cry for love or it is showing love. Now, if somebody is showing you love, what is the only sane response back? If somebody is crying for love or help, what is the only sane response back? Sometimes the most loving thing you can say is no. Sometimes the most loving thing you can say is you can't just, molest little kids and not go to jail. It's all with the intention in which you're doing it. So forgiveness doesn't mean that you become a doormat. It means you hold people accountable for what they've done. But then you also hold yourself accountable for how you're responding. And what so many of us do is something happens in our life and we react to it. We don't know how to pause. We don't know how to breathe. That is the gift of yoga, is it teaches us how to pause. It teaches us to have that space where we can actually make a choice instead of just reacting. Because your reacting comes from habit. It comes from conditioned thinking. Responding can come from love. And so that's what I learned to do. So I have a really big toolbox now. I have humor in there. That's one of the gifts my mother gave me. We could laugh at anything. I have A Course in Miracles. I have yoga. I have passage meditation. I have all these tools. The difference is that I use them now. It's not enough to just know they're out there. You have to be curious. You have to want to be involved in your own healing. And there's a joke we say in A Course in Miracles. We say, look, even Jesus was only on the cross for 3 days. Get down. We need the wood. Right? But this is what we do. It's like we have these things that cause us to suffer. And we have these things that cause us to suffer. And we forget that, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. But we have these things that happen that cause us to suffer. And instead of pulling out our tools or reading a book or talking to a friend or going to therapy or getting mentoring or whatever you do, right? We choose to build altars to our suffering and then we worship at it. Because we get something from playing small. We don't think we do, but we do. And so the work that I do now in the world as a spiritual mentor is helping people let go of their stories of the past so that they can move forward really vibrantly, really deeply connected to God, Spirit, the divine, love, your higher power. I don't care what you call it. But it's moving through the world in a really informed way about the truth of who you are. Aligning yourself with the divine. So that you're not reacting from this small, limited ego sense, that you are really living from this place where you understand who you are and to whom you belong. And if you move through the world that way, you start to see everything as opportunity. And so now for me, no matter what happens, it's not like I don't get pissed off, like something stupid, I got a ticket. No right on red. And I could have complained to the guy and said, look, I'm thinking about my talk about my dead, murdered mother, and I didn't see the sign. But I'm like, no, there's something in it for me. So now I move to the world and I'm like, you know what? Everything is happening for me. It's not happening to me. And when you start to think about life that way, that you are an extension of the divine, that you are a child of God, that you are amazing, not just me, all of us, you can move to the world in a totally empowered way. And that's what I want for everybody. I really believe if people understood who they were, if people knew that they could make a choice, if Paul Carvo knew that he could pause, that he could take a breath, that he could choose again, I believe my mother would still be alive. And so my mission is to create a less violent world. But I start with me. We can't control what anybody else is doing. So your job is to just start working your own little corner of the garden. You can't complain about the shit blowing around your neighborhood if your backyard is a mess. So for me, you start there. And because I want a less violent world, I try to eradicate every bit of violence within myself. And so my compassion didn't just stop at humans, it started to extend out to animals. And no offense, but I will choose a puppy over a baby any day of the week. I love animals. They've always been one of my greatest connections to the divine. And so I realized that my whole life I had been calling myself an animal lover while I was still eating them. And then I thought, well, how can I love them if I'm eating them? And how can I love them if I'm paying somebody else to murder them for me? And I remember around the time that I started thinking about this, my love for animals, the choices I was making, that I was also receiving a lot of information on my research for the book. And one of the questions I'd always ask myself was, did my mother suffer? Because a lot of spiritual people over the years, trying to be kind to me with all their different theories, said, well, when you're fighting for your life in that way, your adrenaline gets so high that she probably didn't feel anything. And then somebody else said to me, well, I like to think that in acts of violence, the soul leaves the body before they're aware. And so I'd always question this. And I remember getting the newspaper articles from this woman because, remember, my family never ever talked about it, so it wasn't until like 20 years later that I started to figure out what had been going on. And one of the articles said, talking about my mom, she had cuts and scrapes on her hands and knees from trying to get away. And it occurred to me in that moment, like everything just wants to live. Everything wants to be free from harm. And I became vegan. I've been vegan for 14 years now because I just do not want to participate in the suffering of any other living creature. Not you, not my furry friends. And so to kind of, wrap it up, one of the things I want to say is that, with spiritual mentoring, I know how powerful and effective it is to have a mentor. So I highly encourage you to just find somebody who's doing work that resonates with you, whether it's yoga, chanting, prayer, meditation. I don't care what it is, but find somebody. But one of the things to also remember is I say, like, mentors will take you a long way, but tormentors will take you a wicked long way too. So all these things that are happening to you are happening for you. And to not get small, to actually stand in your power, to remember who you are, know that there are tools, know that you are loved, know that you are powerful beyond measure. You can overcome anything. And when you're inspired, you'll see people doing like the work that Kathleen does. You'll see people doing the work that Sandy does, because it's not about whether you're afraid or not. It's that you are listening to your deep guided mission. And I believe we all have our own individual curriculum. You all have been called here. And there's a line that we say in A Course in Miracles. It says, the divine calls everybody, but not everybody answers. But just you being here tonight, you're all being called to tell your stories, to do the work that you were born to do, and to go out into the world and be totally amazing. And the last thing I want to say is that I was totally blown away when Jennifer was asking me about doing this event. And I said, well, what's the date? And she said, it's on May 6th. And I just kind of laughed because my mother is hysterical. May 6th, 1981, 36 years ago, was the last night I ever saw my mother alive. And she was found on May 7th, 1981. So tomorrow is the anniversary of her death. So I just want to say thank you all so much for being here with us tonight, being with me, listening to her story. That's part of my mission and legacy, is to tell her story, that we might create a more beautiful and peaceful and just and loving world. Thank you so much.